The economy is the start and end of everything. Good evening and welcome. This is Face the Nation. Our topic of discussion today is back to square one, the state of the country's economy. Joining us this evening on the show are Murtaza Jafferji, chairman of the Advocate Institute, Thilan Vijayasinghe, former chairman of BOI Sri Lanka, as well as an investment banker. Also joining us this evening on Face the Nation is Daniel Alphonsus, former advisor to the Ministry of Finance. To pose questions from our panelists today, on to my immediate right is Theruni Karunaratne, and on to my immediate left is Shriha Raniz, Executive Director of the Centre for Investigative Reporting. You too can join in as far as the conversation is concerned. The number to send in your messages, 076 656 5353. The number once again, 076 656 5353. So let's get the ball rolling today with Murtaza Jafferji, chairman of Advocate Institute. Is the country's economy in a good state? Your time starts now.
So the answer is that we are enjoying currently a spot in the sun, quite literally. It is rather hot outside. But towards the end of last year, there was very preferential rains that came because of a unique event called the Indian Ocean Dipole, where the country got bucketed with a lot of rain, although it's an El Nino year. And the first quarter had a lot of sunshine. That has been very favorable conditions for the construction industry to operate at whatever capacity they can. For agriculture, that is why we are seeing lower vegetable prices, lower food prices, and that's feeding into inflation. There are some base effects, and inflation is at low single digits, and that has given the space for the monetary authorities basically to reduce interest rates. At yesterday's treasury bill auctions, for the first time, all three vintages, 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, all came below 10%. It is highly likely that very soon the PLR will also head towards single digit territory. The Sri Lankan rupee is at 295 rupees, and all growth indicators are picking up. Consumer confidence is going up. It's not a proxy, but even the stock market seems to be rallying significantly. There is more and more liquidity. So to a large extent, we seem to be in a brighter spot, but we are not out of danger because we have a large amount of debt. At the end of last year, the debt is 118% of GDP. The domestic debt, which is about 60% of the total debt, is at an interest rate of about 11%. The foreign debt, after restructuring, will probably be at an interest rate of about 2 to 3%. And we have to grow the economy and post these so-called primary balances, which is revenue minus expenditure without interest, so that over a period of time, like 10 years, the IMF has a projection that we can bring our debt down to 95% of GDP. Now, we don't have much fiscal space and we have to stick the line. So although we are benefiting for some extraordinary situation because of fortuitous circumstances, there's a lot of difficult work ahead of us, and we have to keep going the path. We have to continue to have the reform agenda, and it will take us many, many years without any deviation or slippages. With a bit of luck, we will progress.
Murtaza, you say that we are in a brighter spot. What do you mean by that? Is it because we are not making any repayments on our debt yet? Is that why we are in this situation where you can flaunt about the country's economy now? Or is it something that we should not be too comfortable with at this point of time? Come an election, things would change drastically in Sri Lanka.
So we can't get too comfortable. Yes, it is true partly that we are not servicing our debt. That is on our bilateral debt and commercial debt, which comes to about $20 billion. But we are definitely servicing our multilateral debt, which is about $10 billion. But of course, we are getting more from them than we are repaying that. So from a cash flow basis, we are okay. And then we had a large amount of money that was owed to the Indians, something close to $4 billion. My understanding is that we are repaying them at the rate of $100 million a month. And we have been repaying them for the last 6 months or more, basically. So we are repaying them, but a large amount of debt, we will only be repaying them, as the President said, past 2028, if we get a successful debt restructuring.
So where are we standing right now in terms of the debt restructuring as we speak now?
Yeah. So there are two buckets, one called the bilateral debt, which is about $10 billion. That we have got in principle agreement from them. I think the last time I read that they have agreed that we have to pay about a 2% interest rate, and we will pay them the principal amount over a long period of time, going up to about 15 years. The commercial debt, of which the international sovereign bonds is the largest component, that basically we have to still negotiate. We are coming closer. There's about 12.5 billion of basically principal amounts. There's about 2 billion in arrears, and there's about 2 billion owed to the China Development Bank. The China Development Bank, Shamir, I don't know what is happening there, but on the sovereign bonds, we have had many rounds of negotiations. We are coming closer because the two parties have agreed to sit together and discuss, and I don't have any superior insights. I only have the market price. You know, the low point on our sovereign debt, it was trading at 25 cents to the dollar. At the moment, it's 56 to 57, so it's going up. So the market is sensing that a settlement is coming soon.
However, Murtaza, you say that a settlement is coming soon, but we are all very well aware that if China does not come into the negotiating table, and if there is no concrete or hard decisions that are made, this is not going to happen. This is going to be a far reality. It's not going to happen in the next few months.
So
and
the
we are going to
Chinese,
be on the same
they have
back to square one.
Yeah, so there is about, from the bilateral, $5 billion basically is debt that is owed to the China Exim Bank. That is within the bilateral. The 2 billion that is owed to the China Development Bank is considered a commercial debt. If they don't agree, I don't think it is a showstopper that we can continue.
We can continue.
We can. But subject to correction.
But where is the principle of treating all the
equitable
ISP
treatment.
holders on equitable treatment?
So if somebody else doesn't agree at a future date, if they agree, they have to be treated on equitable treatment. If they get a preferential treatment, all others get the same benefit.
Right. So tell me, Murtaza, in your opinion, when you say that Sri Lanka is on a brighter spot, is it because of the president and his policies that have made things better in the last 2 years?
So he undoubtedly has given the right kind of leadership, because economics is something that he can understand, and for a long period of time he has been trying to do reform in Sri Lanka. You have to also give benefit to the laws that have been changed, including an independent central bank and a competent team at the top, including the governor and the monetary board. You also have to give kudos to the team at the Ministry of Finance. Basically, they are seasoned technocrats, not excessively influenced by the wrong ideology. They believe in the market system. They have been in the system for a very long time, so they understand the deficiencies. They know how to fix the system. And I must say that we have been very fortuitous, because a significant headwind that Sri Lanka always faces is the weather. It was an El Nino year, you know, in August basically. We were fearing the worst, and then suddenly out of nowhere, September, October, November, December became very, very wet. It impacted the economy, but that rainfall bounty filled up our reservoirs, filled up our irrigation tanks, and we harvested that in the first quarter, where from our generation mix, we didn't have to rely excessively on thermal. That saved us foreign exchange. We got a good harvest. The harvest season is the April season. So it's a mix of many circumstances that came together that have permitted this bright spot at the moment. But it is not a reason for us to relax, because we have a lot of difficult reform and changes ahead.
Right. So before I move to Tilan, Murtaza, one final question to you. You say we are on a very bright spot at this time as we speak. However, if you look at the exchange rate, you spoke about it. You said the exchange rate is approximately at around 295, to be very precise, around 292.50 cents. However, the exporters are feeling the hit. It's not going to be easy for exporters. I come from a tea exporting company. This month has been extremely difficult, and it's very evident that small scale exporters will have to close down shop if things would continue in this manner come a few more months.
So I also empathize with your position, because besides coming on a show like yours and pontificating, I have to make a living, and I'm coming from a family company whose main revenues are in exports. So I feel the pressure ourselves. But you must respect what the governor says. We will have a market determined exchange rate. The central bank is not intervening to strengthen the currency. So although people are critical of the central bank, the reality is that the IMF has a net international reserve target of $100 million. That is all they have to buy from the market. In the month of December, January, February, they bought $250 million net. In the month of March, they bought $700 million. So they are absorbing a lot of the flows that are coming in, and so nobody is artificially manipulating the exchange rate. It is trying to find its equilibrium. At the moment, basically, in my opinion, it has excessively strengthened because of those fortuitous circumstances that I said, that we had an energy bounty, we didn't have thermal reserves. You know, CPC was producing furnace oil and they had nowhere to sell it. They were running out of storage space, basically. So there are a number of factors that the high point of the tourist season is the first quarter. So you have massive amounts of conversion happening. We have the Aurudu festival, so remittances peak. So a lot of those factors have come into focus and led to this, but I don't think 295 is an indicator of a year-end target for the currency that I am expecting by the second half of the year. Basically, some of these things go in cycles, that some of these positive flows will reverse.
Example?
So for example, the second half of the year is always drier, basically. It depends on what the monsoon is going to do for us. Your energy mix will change. Brent is at $90 a barrel and they're expecting it, if geopolitical tensions, you know, the first half, the average was about 80. So a lot of factors basically that were propitious to us will probably reverse, and you will see the currency again starting to slip.
But you are very confident when you're saying that the exchange rate right now, there is no ceiling and it is completely determined by the market forces.
Yeah, so as per the new Central Bank Act, what it says is that the exchange rate is your stabilizing mechanism, right? That it will be market determined. My understanding is that they are not doing anything excessively to try to strengthen the rupee excessively, that it is pure market forces. I mean, for example, when
you're saying they are not trying to do something excessively,
yeah,
the feeling that I'm getting is they're trying to do something, but they're not doing it to an extent that would disturb the apple cart.
So for example, if you want to keep strengthening the currency, you will start basically taking action to strengthen the currency. For example, you will start increasing interest rates so that you attract flows into the country and reduce outflows. They are reducing interest rates. So the policy bias is that monetary policy is easing, which is counter-cyclical to a appreciating exchange rate. So as I said, that I don't have the explicit specifics, but my sense is that they are not intervening and strengthening the currency, that it is market forces at the margin that are driving this.
Right. Thank you very much, Murtaza, for your thoughts. I'm already getting a lot of questions from our viewers. I'll take those up when we go along with Q&A from our journalists. I now move my attention towards Thilan Vijay Singh, a former chairman of BOI Sri Lanka as well as an investment banker. Thilan, just a couple of weeks ago, you were featured on Face the Nation special alongside with Deepak Bagla, who was the former CEO of Invest India, which is the BOI in India. I just want you to draw a comparison. Why is India attracting approximately around $600 billion in a span of 6 years? And why hasn't Sri Lanka been able to do anything substantial in the front of investments as we speak right now?
Investment is attracted generally based on confidence, leadership, strong institutions, strong facilitation, and minimal corruption. What we saw from the perspective of attracting FDI over the last 10 to 15 years, we failed miserably to attract manufacturing investments. We were primarily focusing on the non-tradable sector, where we attracted investments in areas such as real estate. Several causes. One is policy inconsistency. You might have an investor who comes today on the basis that we would, these are the sort of taxes that we are going to be paying, but during construction period, in itself, budgets would get passed, national budgets would get passed, new taxes would get introduced, and out goes the budgets. Secondly, a matter that was sacrosanct during the time I ran the BOI was what we call the sanctity of the Board of Investment Agreement. So over the years, the ability of the BOI to frame regulations, waiving, modifying or exempting various taxation regimes to give consistency. And I'm not advocating for tax holidays, it's just consistency. Was that much greater due to the fact that there were no taxes in what we call outside Schedule B of the BOI law, or very few. So therefore investors had a relative comfort that the tax regime was stable over a longer period of time. Several other reasons. A lot of the FDI that we attracted during that time was infrastructure. Overall, I believe the government in the last 10-15 years focused more on public investment. We saw the electricity board, for example, building power plants using sovereign guaranteed debt, increasing the indebtedness of the country. We see the Port Authority with their own money building an East Terminal at a cost of $700 billion, when in fact the private sector can undertake that particular investment more effectively and generate more export revenue. Last 10-15 years, no new industrial parks were built where investors can come and plug and play. So they would have to go outside these EPZs where you have a multitude of approvals to obtain. Ease of doing business deteriorated over the period. Levels of corruption, which was unheard of in the FDI space, increased significantly. So there were a whole host of issues. And then finally, the aspect of leadership, whether it is in the investment promotion agencies or the leadership that would ensure that some of these weaknesses are addressed and decisive action taken.
Thilan, I want to speak about one of the Chinese investments in Sri Lanka, the Port City project. It was earmarked to get approximately $25 billion in a certain amount of years. However, Sri Lanka has not done anything very progressive in terms of attracting these investments. And why is that?
Several reasons. If you were to leave out the intervention of COVID, during which time hardly any investment activity took place, though in some other countries actually manufacturing investments relocated during COVID, particularly when the supply chains were getting disrupted. The key issue with Port City was whether there was sufficient economic growth to justify having a marketable land extent of 500-600 acres coming into the market. Now, the business plan for Port City was to release only about 7 hectares per annum as marketable land. Now, one of the aspects that Port City also had to do was to compete with the rest of the country. So you have a landmass that is, facing the ocean, then you have government-owned landmasses elsewhere also where investors would come. So there would have to be some level of, shall I say, parity that people who should see a significant advantage, why Port City and why not elsewhere in the country. So in that context, the idea was mooted that let Port City be a special economic zone where we would put in place ease of doing business. We would try and match top 25 ease of doing business indicators so that when investors come into Port City, that would become then the benchmark to
Did that happen? Did that happen?
So it did not happen because there was a draft legislation that was presented somewhere in 2017-18. In fact, there were 2 pieces of legislation competing with each other for the attention of the then head of state, and those laws were not implemented. And then when the Rajapaksa government was re-elected in 2019, both these laws were reviewed, and in fact there was a committee of lawyers that recommended what was then called the Harsha De Silva Committee, Special Economic Zone Strategy and the law. However, the then Secretary to the President thought it was prudent to introduce, rather than a special economic zone which was based on onshore principles, all about ease of doing business and not necessarily an international financial center, a law was created which made the entirety of Port City dollarized, without the involvement of the central
So the
bank.
port city was supposed to get approximately 25 billion US dollars in terms of investments.
Correct.
All what we've heard so far is the fact that LOLC, a Sri Lankan-based company, has invested approximately around 95 billion rupees.
That's the only transaction.
That's the only transaction so
In fact, my
far.
company were advisors to that transaction. That's the only 5 blocks have been leased out on a 99-year lease, and not a single other block has been taken by any third-party investor.
White elephant?
Well, the reason is that in my view, the special economic zone law is not a gold standard. International lawyers who would do a due diligence on the port city law as framed by the previous government has fundamental flaws, whether it is a local investor who's going to invest or whether it's a foreign investor.
Right.
And there are regulations that are yet to be introduced
Right.
under the law. There are some fundamental changes to the law that are also required. So unless and until we implement a set of a special economic zone legislation that is of a gold standard where international lawyers can actually recommend investors to part with $100-200 million.
One final question, Thilan. Are you as bullish as Murtaza about the country's economy?
I'm bullish subject to Murtaza painted the picture at the macro level. I always believe that you have to you have to create the foundation, which is the macro, and then focus on the micro by focusing on strengthening institutions, having proper policies, making sure that proper leadership is there in these institutions. Now, where I need to caution is that, are we implementing the reforms fast enough? Are we going ahead with reforming the SOE sector? So that is where, so unless we build confidence amongst investors that yes, we build confidence to the extent to say that yes, Sri Lanka is stabilized.
Right.
But in fact, for that to become more self-fulfilling, where you literally attract investments into multiple sectors, we need a lot of work to be done.
Thanks, Thilan Vijay Singha, a former chairman of BOI Sri Lanka as well as an investment banker. I now move my attention towards Daniel Alfonso's former advisor to the Ministry of Finance. Murtaza painted a picture of a bullish economy. If you do the right things, we will be able to achieve our target with a bit of luck. Thilan says the direction is good, however, policies need to be correct, confidence has to be there, leadership has to be there, as well as minimal corruption has to be there as well to drive the country's economy forward. Daniel, you were a former advisor to the Ministry of Finance. Are you as bullish as the two gentlemen on to your right about the country's economy?
So the question of this show is, are we back at square one? And Murtaza and Thilan have both answered, no, we're not back at square one. We have rectified some of the problems, and there is reason to have some optimism with respect to the future. I'm broadly in agreement with this view. In other words, we're not at square one, but we are at square two. We aren't really in the process of, we haven't recovered. We've stabilized the economy, but we've not recovered, and we have not put in place the measures that are required to prevent such a crisis from happening again. Why do I say that we're back at square one? First, the economy has stabilized. We have positive growth, not negative growth. We don't have fuel queues. We don't have power cuts. Inflation is down. So there is some sense of normalcy in terms of economic activity. The proximate causes for the crisis have also been somewhat addressed. If we look at the revenue side, taxation revenue has increased because tax rates have increased, and much more importantly, direct revenue, that is income tax and other direct taxes have increased. That's partly because the rates have gone up, but partly because tax administration is finally beginning to improve. This is a problem that Sri Lanka has faced for some decades now. The fact that people who should be paying tax are not paying tax. And some of the institutional processes required to start ensuring that they do pay tax, for example, linking the IRD with other government departments, is now underway. Then, in terms of the root causes of the crisis, some initial, very small steps have been taken. The central bank bill that Murtaza referred to is a landmark piece of legislation. It has somewhat depoliticized the central bank, increased its independence,
Somewhat.
and as a result, made it more difficult for any future government to print money, create inflation, and thereby destabilize the economy. But have the root causes of the crisis been addressed? I am not as optimistic on that front. But for that, we need to understand what the root causes of the crisis were. And there are broadly two schools of thought on this. There's one school of thought that ascribes the crisis to corruption. Another school that ascribes it to foolish decisions, essentially. The corruption school is of the view that the rulers of our country took public money, emptied the treasury, spent it for their private benefit, or squirreled it away overseas. And therefore, the remedy to the current crisis is to bring that money back, repay our debtors, etc., etc. And the way to prevent such a crisis from occurring in the future is punishing those who stole that money. The other view is that poor decision making, poor policy was the cause of the crisis.
Foolish decisions.
Yes, the ban on chemical fertilizer, the tax cuts of 2019 when everyone knew that Sri Lanka's public finances were already in a perilous state, the SOE wastage, the choice to borrow foreign currency at high interest rates, the choice to invest in projects that have very little return, like the Mattala Airport, Lotus Tower, so on and so on, so forth. The list is endless. The decision to reject the MCC grant, the decision to end the LRT, all these decisions. There's a consistent pattern of poor decision making that Sri Lanka has experienced. So their argument is that this is the cause of the crisis. Now, I submit that the corruption view is not the primary cause. Corruption is unconscionable. It is something that should be punished. It is something that's deeply pernicious in terms of our polity, our society, our economy. But it is not the primary cause of this crisis. And there are two reasons I would argue. The first is that there are countries who have had levels of corruption that are similar to Sri Lanka, but have had equally have had higher growth rates, or even in some cases consistent double-digit growth rates. Then, if we also look at our own history or our own context, I'd invite you to consider a thought experiment. Now, imagine that the Lotus Tower costs the same amount as double tracking the Kalani Valley line. The Lotus Tower, as we all know, had almost zero economic return. Double tracking the Kalani Valley line, which is solves a major public transportation issue, because Colombo is quite well connected north to south in terms of public transport, but not east to west. So the economic return on that is huge. My argument would be that a Mr. 10% would get the same cut, regardless of whether it was invested in the Lotus Tower or the double tracking the Kalani Valley line. But the public benefit would be hugely greater, and the ability of the Sri Lankan state to repay its debtors would be hugely greater if that money was spent in the Kalani Valley line.
Daniel, very quickly, you said Mr. 10%. Who are you referring to?
I'm not referring to anyone in particular. This is a hypothetical example of a decision maker who might get a cut in the case of any project that takes place.
It can be anyone.
It can be anyone. So coming back to the
You're not from the previous government?
I'm not referring to any specific person. This is a thought experiment to illustrate the point that corruption isn't the primary
cause. But I'm
cause.
sensing that you're getting somewhere to name a person, but you don't want to do it because
this is purely a thought experiment. So now coming back to the
no, there were people who were named after.
In our history, there have been many people who have been named various names, including Mr. 10%. But here, there's just a hypothetical, and in many other countries. So this is a standard trope of a decision maker who gets a cut on a decision. Then
You're just trying to say that there are people in Sri Lanka who got the 10% as well.
I'm not saying that they got it. I'm just saying that in the event that somebody got a cut, the private benefits would be the same in these two cases, but the public benefits would be very different.
But do you think there's someone right now who's taking the 10% as well?
I don't know. I'm not privy to any decisions, so that's what I'm trying to emphasize here is that the quality of policy making, the 90 or 80 or whatever percent that is not stolen, how that is invested is really the decisive factor.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'll come back to you, Daniel, momentarily. So that was Daniel Alfonso's former advisor to the Ministry of Finance. So we have different thought processes with regard to the country's economy. It's going to be a very interesting conversation with Murtaza, Daniel and Tilan on the spotlight today. Let me open the floor for questioning from our journalists. On the immediate right is Theruni, left is Shihar. Shihar, with your permission, shall we start off with Theruni?
Sure.
Yes, Theruni. Yeah.
First question I'd like to get to Daniel. You said in your opening remarks that Sri Lankan tax administration has improved slightly after a very long time. Tax revenue is very important when it comes to expanding the economy, but we've had a history of the big fish always escaping the taxes and the lower class has always been burdened with taxes. What reforms do you suggest to improve a robust tax administration system? Now, after all, the TIN number, they extend the deadline to the 1st of April, but after that we haven't heard much about it. So what are the recommendations you'd make?
Yeah, so Murtaza is in a far better position to comment on this than
I'd like to hear his opinion as well.
I do. But if I were, let's take the two problems. One problem is the problem of ensuring that people who ought to pay do not get out of this because of their ability to influence the system. That really the responsibility is on creating an institutional structure in this country of checks and balances. And I'll touch on that a little later when we go into the causes of the crisis. In terms of the technical side of things, what can be done to ensure the Inland Revenue Department has a better sense of what somebody's income is? What I referred to earlier, the fact that the Inland Revenue Department is now being connected. The computer systems of the Inland Revenue Department are being connected to other departments, and other departments have to give their data to the Inland Revenue Department, allows the Inland Revenue Department to form a much better picture of people's income. This is a decisive step, a sea change. But I think Murtaza will be in a better position to go into some of the other measures that are being taken.
So if you look at the tax law, Theruni, if you earn less than 100,000 rupees a month, you're exempted, right? So if you're exempted, there is no reason for you to have a tax file, and therefore you don't need a tax identification number. But the bedrock of our compliance system is that we have a national identity card number. Now India talks about Aadhaar, but what we had was from the early 1970s that you may remember that if you did the local O level at age 16, you have to go out and get an identity card number. So this identity card number should become a critical identifier in many things that you do. So subject to privacy laws that protect some of your data, all of this can be linked across all the government information systems. And all of us in some way engage with government, from getting your voter card to some benefit that you're getting to your driver's license, etc. So if you have a committed administrative system, it is today in the age of machine learning and expert systems, it is easy to build a kind of a data system that would throw out red flags if you see certain citizen behavior that is not explanative of a person who is earning less than 100,000 rupees. So that deterrent has to be there. And I'm afraid that although some steps have been taken, we have a long way to go, because I sat on many government committees, etc. Many government departments are very territorial about their data. So even the presidential secretariat, some of them were saying that even when they ask for data from various government departments, these departments don't willingly give them the data basically. So we have to overcome these issues, and I believe that using some basic technology, not some high technology, you can develop a system that puts a significant pressure on a taxpayer who is not paying their fair share of taxes, that the authorities can be alerted. And under the 2018 Inland Revenue Law, there is sufficient penalties for avoidance.
So, Murtaza, there are a few questions that I want to take to the panelists that were posed during your opening remarks. So, let me first drag my attention to Murtaza. Industries are closing down, factories are moving to other countries, exporters are suffering with the exchange rate plummeting. Electricity, water and other overheads are still too high. I am not sure how the tea industry would absorb the cost with the increase in the new wages. And you still say that we are in a brighter spot.
Yeah.
How come?
So, whoever this person is, maybe there are some partial truths to that, but the more that we expose our economy to market forces, these very pointers that he or she is making will automatically start adjusting. So, for example, electricity tariffs were reduced by 22%, and that was made a huge contribution to reduce inflation in the month of February, or was it in the month of March? So, like that, all the other input variables will start adjusting. I do sympathize with that person that wages are sticky. So, when you have an appreciation of this nature in especially labor intensive industries, it is very difficult to reduce salaries basically because they are fairly sticky. But my argument is that the exchange rate, I feel, is a very temporary phenomenon, and it will find its market equilibrium during the second half of the year.
Right, so, just as you're talking, Murtaza, I got another question, so I'm going to pose it also alongside with that. If inflation has gone down as you speak, why are prices still so high?
So, this is a see, inflation is the rate of increases of prices. Prices that went up don't necessarily come down. The entire price level has gone up, I mean, in the economy. Inflation coming down does not mean that prices will come down. It is what it's saying is the rate of increase of prices have come down.
Let me ask Murtaza, and then Tilan also can answer this. Now, see, yes, we are in kind of a brighter spot, and the macro indicators.
Are you agreeing?
No, macroeconomic indicators are really coming in a better way than what we had. But people are really angry. They feel the heat, and they want some changes. They want the cost of living to be reduced. They want more wages. They want more salary, right? They are really feeling the heat of these reforms and the IMF deal. Now, we have seen in the past, when you have a situation like this, and especially when there's election, it's a vicious cycle, right? The reforms, whoever who go with the reform are being defeated, and the government comes, and they all started from the scratch, right? How do you see this situation now?
Yeah. So, what is known globally is that for reforms to work, you need a fresh mandate. Unfortunately, we had a kind of change in the president midway through a mandate, and that president did not get a mandate from the people. It came through parliament. It was completely legal. So, the problem is that ideally, if there was a full term and these reforms were done in an early part of a cycle before the next election comes, there would have been sufficient period. Our presidential terms are like 5 years. So, if a new president came and they implemented the reforms in the first year, there would have been a good 3-4 years for those reforms to show fruition. Now, the problem is that we are facing an election somewhere in the month of October, where the benefits of these reforms are yet to be seen, and many of the difficult reforms are still to be passed. So, I believe that in the next 1 month or 2 months, omnibus economic transformation law is coming into force basically, which will have a productivity commission, there will be an investment agency, there will be investment zones. Similarly, that there is a state-owned enterprise law that is in the process. Now, whether these things will be passed in this before this electoral cycle ends, I don't know. But having been involved in some of the committees, there are game-changing benefits that will come from this. Even the new Electricity Act that has just been built, there may be critics of that, there may be deficiencies, but it is all reform in the right direction. And if you bear with me, that 30 years ago, I went to university in Australia. During my stay there, Australia basically was not the most dynamic economy. It went through a very, very deep recession. And their famous finance minister at that time, Paul Keating, who then became the Prime Minister of Australia, said this is a recession Australia had to have. And they did, once they did the macroeconomic reforms in the 1980s, where they liberalized the exchange rate and they had an independent central bank, etc., they did microeconomic reforms. Or they set up the productivity commission, they looked at transportation, electricity, telecom, all the sectors, trade. Australia was a protective state. Today it is an absolute free trade country. So all those reforms took a few years, but by the mid 1990s and late 1990s, the reforms started paying off. And the media called them the wonder from down under, basically, because for 27 years they never had a recession. Most of the advanced economies were going through business cycles and recessions, but Australia went from strength to strength and strength. And that is shown. What is the Sri Lankan dream? The Sri Lankan dream is to migrate to Australia. Now they are obviously doing something right that our people all want to run there, basically. So my argument is that people are angry, and rightfully, but they're angry for the wrong reasons. They can't be angry at the reform. They are angry for the mismanagement and misallocation and misgovernance. But the anger cannot be on the reform. So the anger has to be somewhere else.
So Murtaza, you said that you sit on several government committees right now. Few government committees right now. Then Daniel spoke about the two schools of thoughts. He said corruption was one, the other was foolish decisions that were made. And the call by the people was to bring back the money that was stolen or swindled out. Is there any discussions that are taking place at these government committees that you're talking about in terms of bringing back the money that was swindled out of the country?
Okay. So this is the biggest myth, that it's like there was these reserves and somebody stole the reserves and went away. I'm afraid that the corpus of funds that have been perhaps stolen is a minute fraction of the money that was lost. Daniel put it correctly, but I have my own terminology. It was not misappropriation, but it was misallocation and mismanagement. So for example, some of the so-called stolen money, I benefited. For 10 years, they didn't change electricity price. For 10 years, they kept the tax on petrol at some ridiculously low 15%. Now it's at 41%. India gave us $500 million to buy petroleum, and we sold it 40% cheaper than India. And India is a poorer country than Sri Lanka. So the misallocation of resources, they gave me, I belong to a wealthier household, lower tax rates. They gave tax exemptions, lower rates. They reduced the rate of taxation to 18%. That's where the money went. That's where the debt all came. So this myth that, this country had stolen money and the corruption, etc. Corruption led to bad decisions. Maybe, as Daniel said, private incentives determine decision making. And the most famous one I can say is the CEO of Sri Lankan Airlines tried to misappropriate $16.5 million on those Airbus orders. It cost us $200 million. He only got $2 million. He was trying to get $16.5 million. But the decisions that were taken in buying these aircrafts, cancelling it, paying too high leases cost us $200 million.
But isn't that why the people are angry?
They're angry, and I'm also angry. And some of the people who are angry are leaving the country. But the way to fix it is to get a system. Aragale had it right, and we can discuss that. We need system change. All these reforms and the structural changes and the institutional building and the changing, going away from the executive presidency, changing the electoral system, making the civil service independent. These are all part of the system change that will ensure that these things will not happen. Don't forget the CBOC, the anti-corruption agency. That's a game-changing law basically, and that is also applicable to private companies.
Yeah, the problem is, Murtaza, laws are there, but the implementation of these laws are falling short.
So let's take CBOC. CBOC was there. Now there's a new act. Because when I get involved with many of the think tanks, there was a couple of people who came who are fighting women's rights. They fought for the sexual bribery in the Anti-Corruption Act. And I believe there are already 2 cases. These are with private sector people. Now, whether they will successfully prosecute these people, I don't know. But we have to allow these institutions time to mature and build themselves.
But Daniel, are you buying the answer that was given by Murtaza in terms of the 2 schools of thoughts and bringing back the money? We all got benefited at one point out of this.
Yeah, so I agree with Murtaza, and I'd also add to that the record of bringing back money from any other country where money has been stolen is very poor. The STAR unit in its entire history, the STAR is the main World Bank unit that helps countries engage in stolen asset recovery. In their entire history, they've only brought back about $1.5 billion. So these are very small amounts of money that are actually recovered. And secondly, it takes a very long time, years and years, if not decades. So therefore, as a solution, even if one concedes the point that there was a large sum of money stored overseas, our ability to get that back is very limited. And I completely agree with Murtaza that actually most of it was recycled back into our economy suboptimally, through misallocation, through rich people getting money, and through projects that didn't make any sense and have no viability.
So Shihar spoke about how people are angry at this point of time. So one of the recent news items that was published on Newsfirst was the fact that parliamentarians are trying to get duty-free luxury vehicles. Is this fair under the current economic climate?
So the question of compensation of senior officials or public servants is a chicken and egg problem, because we don't pay our senior public servants very much. On the other hand, we also expect very little from them. So unless we are able to solve this problem by paying public servants, this includes MPs, it includes senior civil servants, executive grade civil servants, we are going to have low quality people entering the system. And as a result, we don't want to pay them very much also. So we need to find a way to solve this chicken and egg problem where we start paying our civil servants and public servants well, but also demand and expect a high quality of service from them.
So Tilan, before I move to Shihar, why is that UAE don't have the best laws when setting up economic zones such as Jebel Ali Free Zone, Dubai Internet City and Dubai International Finance City DIFC for an example? But still they attract top global companies and Sri Lanka lags behind, lying like a tortoise.
Our laws are substandard. And laws are made in a manner that at times are rather fluid. You can have different regimes coming in, governments change, but there's, 1 year's budget is, there's never been consistency in hardly over the last 10 years in taxation. I mean, so as Murtaza pointed out, there's a plethora of new laws that are coming into place. So in order to attract these types of blue chip companies, I can go back to the late 90s when we had a situation of a war, and I can list out a whole host of blue chip companies that came into this country, from YKK Zippers to Telia to the owning company of Suntel. We had top US corporations coming in to build power plants. We had NTT coming to invest in Sri Lanka Telecom, because there was a consistent, transparent process through which investors could invest. Now, all these issues were muddied, and to answer the question of what it takes to address some of the issues my two colleagues on either side of me have been talking about, apart from that, look at the poor levels of digitization. We are amongst the worst in developing countries. For example, we are talking of tax leakages. Some of the computer IT systems of Inland Revenue, Customs and Excise have been subpar, leaving room open for manipulation. Take, for example, why, despite Murtaza mentioning in 1971 we had a national identity card system, I know of at least 3 tenders for us to have our own digital ID failing, because I can mention one particular tender some years back where a highly respected private sector individual resigned from the evaluation committee because suddenly, for example, there was an unsolicited proposal for a digital ID, and then when it was put aside, and then a tender was called, and to see the tender documents were tailor-made to give that award to that particular that particular company. He resigned, and we failed. So the sad situation is that if you look at how corruption has been eliminated in the transfer of subsidies, I remember listening to the Indian High Commissioner, $30 billion has been saved in terms of money wasted in transferring subsidies to the poor by virtue of the introduction of the Aadhaar card. And finally, after having failed a multiple number of times to introduce digital government in this country, with the basic building block being the digital ID, now the Indian government is giving us grant funding to implement. Even that is stuck in certain areas. So unless and until we sort out our procurement method, and this is what I talk about, the focus on the micro, we strengthen institutions, we digitize government, we pay public servants more. There's a whole host of reforms that we need to implement. Why are we complaining about paying a million rupee salary to a top? I mean, I was paid 100,000 rupees in 1995 as chairman BOI. If you inflation adjusted to today, that's at least 1.1, 1.2 million rupees a month. I was headhunted from the private sector. So we've got to get over really this phobia on digitization, paying public servants, and really reform at the core and build the institutions that we can actually take our economy to another level. Otherwise, we'll be back in this cycle of going back to the IMF in another few years.
Shamir, if I can, sorry, I want to say an important point. You know, we have to design systems that work. And economists say that it is not intentions but consequences that matter. And Sri Lanka has a lot of unintended consequences that have led to a lot of this crisis. Now, you asked Daniel about the car permit. Where did the car permit for MPs come? In 1978, when we changed the constitution, we changed the electoral system because the thinking was that the first past the post system was not representative of the popular vote. So we came up with the PR system, the proportional representation system. Then you had a party list and you competed on an electorate because our electorate is entire district, right? So then the political authorities or the leaders of the party decided who the party list is. So there was a discomfort that, you know, one person decided who will come on the party list. So then they introduced this Manapa system where members from the same political party have to compete in the same district. Now, electorate like Colombo has 1.7 million voters. It is 700 square kilometers. You need a lot of money to be in politics. Somebody went and told the then president, I can't be in politics because I can't afford to be in politics. One of the solutions was to give a duty-free permit. So he said, okay, you go and sell the duty-free permit and that will fund your election campaign. Then they gave other licenses. So they were perverse outcomes. So we have a problem, Shamir, of design, mechanism design. We have to redesign these systems to take out perverse incentives. And sometimes in Sri Lanka, intentions are good, consequences are disastrous.
Tilan, I want to ask now, one of the key reforms the government has brought in is the SOE reforms, right? Basically, it's called privatization or diversion or basically selling, right? Selling the government stake in SOEs. But the appetite for this reform is declining. Now people are, protesting against these some of these reforms, and there is a delay from the government side. There is a delay, and how do you see this? I mean, how crucial it is, because we have seen, like, we have one government or state official for every 16 people, right? 1.6 million for 22 million people. So how do you see this? I mean, where are we heading with these delays?
The delays are coming from those who have a vested interest. If you one of the factors we failed to mention here, a lot of the debt that we are not servicing today were taken by the SOEs. At the moment, the crisis in the electricity board is and what is resulting in all the reforms is there are several $100 million owed to the state banks that cannot be absorbed by the treasury, which has to be paid back. If you look at some of the procurements that have happened, I'll give you just one example. There was a particular PPP that never got implemented for an elevated highway. The engineer's estimate was 40% more than what the private sector estimate was. You see, so in my view, no government lost an election because of privatization or SOE reform. I can tell you this because I was involved in telecom privatization.
Yeah.
I was at forums such as these. One of the questions that was asked to me live, why should a state-owned enterprise be reformed? I had the answer. I mean, the answers are very clear. And then the question was, why should we privatize the port? The result was 85% improvement in ship waiting time, 60% improvement in port productivity. We became a hub port. Why did we do that? Because if the port goes on strike, for example, exporters cannot export.
But the question is, when you give away companies that are doing well, let's take a look for an example, Sri Lanka Telecom. The stake that is owned by the government is going to be sold to a private company. Take a look at Sri Lanka Insurance for that matter. So it's about cherry picking here, isn't it, at the end of the day?
It's about how efficiently is the government running that particular business, because in Sri Lanka I can't think of a single example where there has not been political interference in a way SOA has been in terms of selling. Because these enterprises, when they are sold to, if they're sold to the right parties who would grow the business, apart from getting that upfront money, you're going to get more tax revenue with the growth of those companies in the future. That's what happened in the telecom sector.
So are you trying to say, hypothetically, if there is an NPP government that comes into...
What I'm trying to say is that unless we address the issue
because the NPP is the only party that is right now saying that state-owned enterprises should not be sold. It has to be restructured in a way that is made profitable. While all the other contenders to the presidential spot are saying that government should not be involved in doing businesses and circles as well as political fora. So given that fact, do you think that if an NPP government comes into play, will be from the frying pan into the fire?
What I'm saying is that unless any government that comes into power figures out where the money is going to come from to retire the debt that are impacting on our banking system, that are resulting in inefficient procurement, resulting in monopolistic practices, we are not going to have an efficient economy that is going to attract investment and that is going to give confidence to the private sector. Should the government be owning Hyatt Hotel or Hilton Hotel, which Hilton has never paid a dividend? The Hyatt is, the capex that has gone to Hyatt is probably 40-50% than what it should have been. There was wastage, there was corruption. So in the case of, as I was mentioning, in the case of the CEB, I can tell you of several projects where the private sector would have built it far more efficiently, where the effective tariff cost would have been lower.
But right now, when we're talking about a privatization, or the minister in charge is trying to move the cabinet paper on the restructuring of the CEB, there is a lot of protests made by trade union activists who are attached to the CEB. Should the government take note of the voices at the ministry, or should it not take care of it, just go ahead and move with its agenda?
No, in my view, the government has taken note, and if you look at the electricity sector, probably there are only 7 countries in the whole world that have not unbundled their electricity sector, where generation, transmission and distribution have been hived off into separate entities, and each one competes with each other, eventually leading to the wholesale market. I can give this to you by example, better at explaining live examples. When I was directed by the then government in the late 90s to procure private power, every one of those was procured on a solicited basis. There were no unsolicited proposals. The cost of power that we managed to procure at that time, 25 years ago, was cheaper than India, right? But if you look at the situation today, India has moved towards a wholesale market subsequent to the unbundling. 3-4 cents. I mean, let me tell you, for example, data centers. I was meeting a particular party in India who was saying, look, we are now building data centers that are in the US are relocating to India because the cost of power is 7 cents. Now, if that same data center is to come to Sri Lanka, our cost of power that you would have to pay would be 15 cents. So it's not viable. Now, how has India managed to do that? It's not necessarily because of scale. It is because they unbundled the sector, encouraged competition, and eventually created the wholesale market.
But sir, now all the political parties, I think the major political parties, unlike in the past, they say they want to kind of some changes in the IMF deal. Like in the past, we have seen the political parties coming out and saying we will cancel the IMF deal. Now they are not saying that, right?
They say that they'll renegotiate, like the
exactly
today.
renegotiate and
Sajid
change.
Premadasa at the media rally said that they would renegotiate terms with the IMF.
Yeah, I mean, how do you see the IMF deal and its importance to the current situation?
So, I think with politicians, you should see what they do, not what they say, basically. I mean, they may say for popular consumption that they are going to renegotiate, but if they were in power, would they do it? Or they will make it known that they renegotiated, but maybe they dotted an I and crossed the T, but in substance they can't do much, basically. Because the IMF has said very clearly, this is revenue based consolidation. It is not expenditure. They are not saying you cut expenditure. In fact, one of the conditionalities that they said that social welfare payments, that at least 180 billion has to be spent, and you can't achieve your primary balance target, which is revenue minus expenditure without interest, by reducing that welfare spending. So the IMF is extremely clear that you is about 0.8% of GDP, and there is room to increase that. So most of this heavy lifting of us going from something like a primary balance deficit of 4% of GDP, heading to 2.3% surplus, is all coming on the back of revenue. At a low point in 2020 or 2021, we had 7.5% of GDP. We are supposed to get to 14% of GDP by 2026, basically. So it's all coming on the back of revenues. Now comes the taxes. Let's be realistic here, that 51% of national income goes to 20% of the households. Right? Top 10% get 36%. The bottom 10% only get 1.6% of national income, and the bottom 20% get 4.5%. So this revenue has to be got from this top 20%. There is no point going after the rest because they are just too poor. More like you have to give them subsidies like Aswasuma, etc. They will be beneficiaries of social transfers. So this is where in the program that they are trying to target the people who can afford to pay. Number of households who come within that 36%. Of course, they are the very wealthy because the top 1% in Sri Lanka probably has 40% of the wealth. They are very soon going to put out a draft law of a property tax. I would have preferred the property tax to be where it is a devolved subject, that the money goes to local government, municipality. That is how it is there all over the world because land is a devolved subject. But my understanding is that this property tax will have a different flavor, that it will come to the central government. So it is an indirect proxy to wealth. So to a large extent, these revenues are really targeted to the rich people and those who can pay. Of course, when you have things like the VAT, etc., there's VAT on everything. So even the poor people have to pay, and as a proportion of their income, because they consume more, it is considered regressive. But majority of these taxes, 80% of what they collect is coming off this top 20%. So what we should be doing is the Aswasuma, this is 0.8 and a lot of criticism that the wrong people get it and the right people don't get it. We should slowly increase from 0.8 to 1 to 1.2 so that the bottom 50% basically can offset some of this tax burden. But we have to really go after the top 20%, and there are significant number of people who are not paying. So there has to be a conscious effort, and there has to be a social contract in Sri Lanka that it is socially unacceptable for you to avoid paying taxes.
Can we have a question?
Yeah. Murtaza, now we have elections coming towards the end of the year. And what if there's a major shift of power from the current government to a completely new party, completely new government? As Shihar said, it's a vicious cycle. Some people prefer to start from scratch and they might renegotiate with the IMF. What does this mean in the entire economic recovery journey for Sri Lanka?
Okay. Taruni, Sri Lanka has zero room to expand, 118%, right? There is no red line, but for a middle income market access country, it should be more like 60% of GDP, right? At the height, we were at 128% of GDP. So even though we are doing this debt restructuring, etc., we are still massively in debt, right? So the only way that we can get out without having a second default, right? And the evidence is against us because the probability of default of a second default is more than 50% of countries who have already defaulted, right? So what you have to do is you have to stay the course, and we need luck also, right? Now we can't experiment. Now if a new government comes and they have policies that are better than the current policies, basically so be it. If they have a way to implement faster, if they can enforce a social contract, that people think that they are less corrupt and therefore I'm willing to pay taxes because I think these people are going to be the custodians of the money and they are not going to waste, that is going to be good. But if we regress and say that no, the state has a role to play in the economy and state ownership has been there. I'm a member of the State-Owned Enterprise Restructuring Committee. You will have to call me for a special session on SOE because I have so many stories to say. And I have a ringside seat to see how much of misallocation, mismanagement, ruination we have done with keeping these things in government ownership. But we won't have the time today. So the only way we can avoid this is we have to grow and grow. And we have to grow by improving national productivity. And improving national productivity needs competition.
So,
so we can discuss that.
So Daniel, given what Murtaza is saying, that whoever comes in has to have better policies than the government who's sitting on board, who do you think is the best fit to lead the country at a future election?
We will have to wait to see the policies in detail. So far, none of the parties have released their manifestos. They've not said on what basis they're going to renegotiate with the IMF. So I think having as I said, we have very little space to experiment. We have to do the reforms that have been long delayed and continue the course that we embarked on in 1978 and stopped in 2004. We need to open up our economy. We need to make markets free. And we need to let the state focus on its core competencies. High quality healthcare, high quality public infrastructure. The state is delivering on none of these fronts. Instead, it is trying to do 501 other things.
So Daniel, we brought in two other competitors for fuel distribution, apart from IOC, to minimize the cost, to bring down the cost and to have competition. But now what happens is when the Ceylon Cipetco brings down the prices, all the other three companies also adjust the price based on the prices that have been put forward by Cipetco. So where is competition? Who is going to offer something lower?
So if we look at the history of Sri Lanka, let's take telecom. When competition came in, prices went down, quality went up. If we look at the ports, when privatization took place, the time it takes to unload and reload a container, the price of shipping fell. If we take now ground handling services is being liberalized at BIA, we see a similar pattern. Everywhere we have liberalized the economy and opened up for competition, we have seen prices fall and we have seen the quality of service increase. And to come back to your Cipetco argument, it's not the case that prices have increased as a result of competition or service delivery has fallen. So at the very least, we can say it's not made anyone worse off. And there's so many cases in which it has made everyone better off.
Murtaza, you sound a bit today like a politician. Why is that? Is it because you're sitting at several government committees? Because I recollect Murtaza. The Murtaza that I know in 2020 was someone who came on the show and said the economy is in the ICU. There needs to be correction immediately. If not, we are going to be dead. But today, the Murtaza that I'm seeing right now is very much different to that Murtaza that I saw in 2020.
So you're not the first person to ask me this, and people ask me whether I have become very political. I like good policies. I criticize bad policies. If the policy is about opening up, if the policy is about competition, if the policy is about doing the right things, I will commend it.
So the policies that we are having right now is the right policies, right direction?
We are moving in the right direction. For example, you asked about the fuel. That's a sector that I closely look at because IOC is a listed company and I've been watching them for 20 years. Majority of the fuel price is now tax, and it's the right thing to do. Our taxation is very similar to what India does. Fuel, for too long, it's the single biggest item of import. We were giving it away, we were giving what's called a tax subsidy. We were taxing it lower than everything else in the economy. Today on the petrol price, taxes are 41%. On diesel, it is 32%. So the reason why fuel prices have gone up is due to taxation and of course the depreciation of the currency and international prices. The inefficiency in the system may be accounting for 5 rupees. So the competition etc. could reduce the prices by 5 rupees, 10 rupees at the very maximum in time to come.
So
the majority of the price is tax.
So Murtaza, I want to pick your brain on restructuring the debt now. Recently, I was reading an article that was done by Dr. W. Vijayawardena, former Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. He says that the ideal outcome should entail a massive haircut of about 51% of the bilateral and commercial borrowings of Sri Lanka, which is approximately around 30 billion US dollars. So if you look at a 51% haircut, would that be something that would be negotiated at the table?
So I'm not so sure where that 51% came. I don't know whether he's referring to on an NPV basis, because what happens is that you have to take the adjusted interest rates and you have to take the adjusted principal value and discount it by something called the exit yield. Then you will come to these 50% kind of figures. But I don't think there is a need to haircut basically the principal values by 50%, because what the IMF said is that some of the figures that you gave are not 100% accurate. Let me repeat it again. We have about 10.5 billion owed to the multilateral.
So 11.4 billion to bilateral creditors, 19 billion to commercial creditors, and a swap facility of about 2 billion dollars to China.
Yeah, so they are including
so that's approximately around 32 billion.
They are including the central bank liabilities also in that. So basically, the IMF says, and those central bank liabilities are not in the debt restructuring perimeter. What the IMF is saying is that your external debt servicing has to be restricted to 4.5% of GDP. So all repayments basically and interest cumulatively cannot exceed 4.5% of GDP. Now our GDP last year was about 83 billion. So 4.5% of 83 billion is the amount per year that we can afford for external debt restructuring. So debt repayment. So certain things we have not restructured. So once you reduce that, how much space do you have for the others? So you have to restructure within that parameter rather.
So let's take a look at the numbers a little bit more closely, Murtaza. So you're saying that when will we have to start paying our ISP holders?
So the repayments are running up to 2038, and I think the first principal payments are starting in 2028, I think. So over a period of 10 years, we are repaying. But if we do a deal, we have to immediately start paying interest or coupons at about 4%.
At 4%. So given the fact that you said 83 billion US dollars is the GDP of Sri Lanka, and we can pay based on the IMF regulations. If it's 4%, 4.5%,
it's about 4 billion.
It's around 4 billion US dollars. So paying this 4 billion is not difficult at this current point of time, having a 4.9 billion US dollars as reserves.
Yeah, so you don't use the reserves basically because you're getting flows, no? So what the IMF does is they design a program. So they forecast what will happen to the real economy, the monetary sector, the external sector, the government, and they are projecting certain government borrowings also. So there are inflows, there are current account flows, all of that is going into servicing this debt.
So right now, Murtaza, correct me if I'm wrong here. In the next 12 months, Sri Lanka has to pay 1.3 billion US dollars to multilateral creditors.
Yeah, I know that we have to pay India at the rate of $100 million a month.
So that comes up to 1.2 billion US dollars by the end of the year.
That I think is outside this
scope.
Yeah, so that one, the multilaterals are anyway giving us money, the World Bank, ADB, there's fresh loans also coming in. No?
So where is the ADB, IMF money allocated right now?
So
what are they using that money for?
Yeah, so what the IMF did is that the money that they said they're going to give us could be used for budgetary support. Normally it is to build up the reserves of the central bank. This time the program allows the government to convert it into rupees and use it, although it will remain with the central bank. So at the moment it is sitting in the reserves of the central bank.
So nothing has been done or utilized at the moment?
My understanding, the last time I checked, was it had not been converted for government financing, subject to correction. My data may be a few months old, but so far basically the dollars are lying with the central bank.
So don't you think, Murtaza, I'm now going to ask you a political question because I asked you before, why are you being so political?
You know, there are two other people.
No, I definitely ask them as well. Don't worry, I'll come to them momentarily. But I want to ask you first. Don't you think all this is happening right now because we are talking about an election and we know the nature of any politician, may it be Ranil Wickremesinghe, Sajid Premadasa, or Andrew Kumar Dissanayake, come an election, they suddenly have a magic wand in their hands. They pull out various things out of the black hat. It can be a rabbit, it can be anything else. Right now, don't you think that is what's happening as far as the country's economy is concerned? In the next 12 months, restrictions will be lifted to bring down vehicles. All, when you look at it, hunky-dory, there you go, Sri Lanka on the right track. And here we go, we have Murtaza Jafarji 2 years ago who said, we're in the ICU commenting about the country's economy and being very bullish.
Yeah, so what I said is the economy has stabilized, but I also caution that there's a lot of hard work ahead of us to grow. And the growth has to come through productivity, which requires a lot of reform and competition, which is going to impact the privileged classes, because privileged class don't like competition. Now coming back to your question about the senior bowlers, whether they are throwing out senior bowlers, basically. Sri Lanka has always been characterized that elections are an auction of non-existing resources. Okay? But fundamentally, there are two things that have changed. One is, according to the central bank law, although there is a transitionary provision that goes on till March 2025, since we are in an IMF program, no more money printing, right? So whatever political party that promises certain things, they will have to make those promises basically either by redirecting expenditure or taxing, both very difficult. And since we have such an enormous amount of debt and we have to post a primary balance surplus, it is going to be very difficult to borrow to make those things unless we exit the IMF program, right? And if we try to exit the IMF program, it is disastrous because we just, and no politician is saying that we are going to exit this thing. So this time, and we also have a public budget office, which is supposed to cost these promises by parties. As Daniel said, we haven't seen the manifestos, and I don't know whether the public debt office is fully operational. I think they have advertised for a director general or a CEO, but the sooner that it comes into force, it's better, because one mandate of them is to cost these promises that various political parties will be doing. How much will it cost? So they can throw these things about cars, etc., which is not going to majorly move the needle. But it's going to be very interesting how this election plays out, because you can't make these frivolous promises anymore. Either they're going to make these promises and not be able to keep them.
Daniel.
So, Shah, just give me a second, because If I don't ask a particular question from Shihar and Daniel, Daniel, Murtaza will be crossed at me. So I'm going to ask you a political question now, Tilan. Tilan, recently your one-time boss, do you know who that is? Your one-time boss? Chandrika Bandaranayak Kumartunga.
Okay, you refer to her that way. Okay.
So, Tilan, speaking at a media conference recently when she was posed a question about whether or not Sri Lanka should resort to the IMF, she said that Sri Lanka should go to the IMF. There is no question about that. However, people are suffering at the moment, and that should be looked at very, very aggressively at this point of time. If not, come an election, things are going to be very, very difficult for the ruling party to gain momentum at an election platform or a podium. What are your thoughts?
I agree with her. I must also remind you that 7 of her 10 years in government was the longest period Sri Lanka did not go to the IMF. And that is because we were having 5-6% GDP growth and we had healthy reserves. Exports as a percentage of GDP was over 30% at that time compared to the 15% at the moment. So, and the reforms were happening, you know, in telecommunication, power generation, etc. And public-private partnerships accounted for 40% of FDI at that time.
But those were also not the best years for the Sri Lankan economy, Tilan.
Because of the war situation.
But we all know, because we have to be very open about it as well.
Absolutely, but we did not have a foreign exchange reserve.
When you say that it was the best time, then people.
No, what I was saying is that we did not have to go under an IMF program during that period. Yes, there were serious challenges. I mean, I had blood on my shirt during the '96 bomb blast. I don't know how it came there. But in order to address the suffering of the people, one way of doing that is encourage private investment, because the government cannot create these highways to nowhere or airports to nowhere anymore and have those filtered down to contractors, etc. We've got to address the issue of building private investment confidence, whether it's local or foreign. And there are many ways of doing that. We can look at reform in the agriculture sector. There are hundreds and thousands of acres of degenerated lands that we can put towards export agriculture. We can reform the plantation sector. That's another topic by itself to address some of the issues that you spoke about. So that the private sector can go beyond growing tea and grow more profitable crops so that the estate workers also can benefit. We've got to look at, why are we still only giving lip service to being a hub and our location advantage? We've barely scratched the surface in terms of encouraging Sri Lanka becoming a logistics hub. Our mineral sector, we've got billions of dollars, whether it is natural gas or titanium or phosphate, that is yet to be exploited, which can be export industries. Now the World Bank is telling us we have 55 gigawatts of offshore wind, which can then lead to green hydrogen, and that's one of the reasons why there's the grid interconnection being planned between India and Sri Lanka, so that we can export power. So there are short to medium to longer term initiatives to encourage private sector investment, including in the rural communities through agribusinesses, strengthening the value chains. We're still scratching the surface in terms of, say, organic food exports. I know of a particular company, some of them are clients of my investment banking company. You need to, they export, let's say you're exporting $40 million worth of organic exports. We need to go to them and say, what do we need to do to give, say, encourage you to grow to $80 million, $100 million? Often it is land. And we have an abundance of land, whatever anyone says. I've physically seen some of these lands. But there are a multiplicity of bureaucratic issues, hurdles, multiple government ministries, even when you start an investment project.
So Tilan, the problem is right now we're talking about state-owned enterprises. We're talking about Sri Lankan Airlines these days a lot, because there have been expression of interest made by a lot of companies to buy over Sri Lankan Airlines at this point of time. However, the cabinet decided a few weeks ago to invest $700,000 plus to lease out new aircrafts. Is this a proof?
I am not aware of the decision. I don't sit on their board or anything of that sort. But I can only conjecture that in order to maintain some minimum safety standards or minimum levels of service, that one needs to upgrade your aircraft. Again, Sri Lankan Airlines operationally have improved, I mean, in terms of their ability to generate cash, but the debt load, still remains at about $1 billion, and from what I know, Sri Lankan Airlines is servicing the debt.
So Daniel,
Most of the debt has now been taken over to the balance sheet of the government. The debt has been reduced significantly. There's only $175 million which is owed to the bondholders and some working capital of about $60 billion.
Because no one is going to take over with that, sort of a balance sheet.
You would need to clean the balance sheet.
Daniel, you spoke about this asset recovery and corruption. Now IMF has also come up with this governance diagnostic assessment report. Now, one of the main issues we see is nobody is accountable or nobody is responsible for what happened in the past, right? It is sort of economic crimes, right? The Supreme Court came up with a ruling that Rajapaksas and some of their officials were responsible for the economic or wrong economic decisions. Now, what's happening now is like we know what happened in the past, but there is no accountability. Nobody is there to take the responsibility, or everybody is unpunished because there is no laws, right? I mean, given this, given this background, how do you see things moving forward? I mean, what is the credibility we have or assurance we have that in future nobody will come and do the same mistake again? First, I just want to, in fact, I want to ask this question from you, but you have been talking a lot. After that, you can speak.
When it comes to accountability, there are two types of accountability. There's legal accountability and political accountability. When we take issues like corruption, which is a criminal matter, it's an offense, that is a legal matter. In other words, our justice system, our law enforcement system should bring anyone who engaged in corruption to book and put them in jail. Of course, what our country has shown is that we have not been able to do that. Our legal system does not work. Our law enforcement system does not work. And that is a combination of institutional design right from the very top. So the 19th Amendment to the Constitution created a constitutional council that was supposed to make appointments to these institutions, the courts, the police, and so on and so forth, more independent. That was never allowed to fully come into fruition. It was there only for a short period of time. Then in the 20th Amendment, that whole structure was withdrawn. With the 21st, it's partially there, but it's not operating properly. So from the constitutional level down, we have to reform the institutions to ensure that there are impartial people, people of integrity, people of honesty, who are put in those positions, not because a particular person selects them, but because the institutional structure has checks and balances that do that. And then the issue of corruption and legal accountability can be considerably resolved. You also referred to bad economic policy making, poor judgment, stupidity, foolishness. That is a question, in my view, for political accountability. What I mean by political accountability is you fire those people. You don't vote for them in the elections. Now, our electorate has also failed persistently. They have continued to elect people who have persistently exhibited bad judgment, made bad decisions. And they have not elected people who have made competent decisions or elected them as much and rewarded those. So I think it's really a question of on the one hand, institutional design and making sure we have, in particular, the necessary constitutional amendments. And there, Murtaza referred to the executive presidency being abolished. If you look at the mistakes that were made over the last few years, the organic fertilizer ban, the tax cuts of 2019, and so on and so forth, it was because one person, against everyone's advice, or at least most sensible people's advice. In the case of the tax cuts, the Central Bank and Finance Ministry officials both advised against it. In the case of the agriculture, the fertilizer ban, agricultural researchers, farmers all opposed it. But one man was able to make those decisions. We need to create a system where there are effective checks and balances, and that means abolishing the single point of failure, which is the executive presidency.
Right. I want to, Shehar, do you have any questions, Theroni?
Yes, I'd like a small follow-up question on that. Daniel, you spoke about the failures of the electorate, how they've just kept electing people who should have been held politically accountable. For the public to not make that mistake again, given that we have elections coming up this year, and given that manifestos aren't out yet, what should we expect to see before casting our vote to make a very conscious and accurate decision this time?
So I think the most important element is identifying the problem. Once we're clear about what the problem is, we can then put the necessary solutions in place. So I think we should be honest and say, look at our history and say, we've not done very well. And especially now compared to some of our countries that were in far worse positions. Sri Lanka was ahead of Korea in the 50s. We were ahead of a number of Southeast Asian countries in the 60s and 70s. We were ahead of Vietnam in the 90s. Now we're behind all these countries. So our record has been very poor, and we need to sit down and identify those causes. And the causes have been poor governance, not having checks and balances in our system, having an overmighty state, both in terms of the number of people the state employs and the number of things the state tries to do, instead of focusing on its core competencies of providing public goods like education, healthcare, public infrastructure, and allowing markets to operate, allowing competition to operate, allowing Sri Lanka to engage with the world. So I think these are going to be some of the key factors that we should look for in manifestos going forward.
Right. Before we close tonight's show, I want to give each speaker 4 minutes to wrap up and tell the public who are watching the show tonight as to what the way forward is, in your opinion, for Sri Lanka. So let's start off with Thilan Vijay, a former chairman of BOI Sri Lanka, as well as an investment banker.
Yes, as Murtaza pointed out, we have very little room to maneuver. Therefore, what we as people should be looking for is how competent and capable would be a future government post the elections of reforming the required institutions from which we are relying for on taxes, whether we are relying to attract investment or whether we are relying to grow industries, to grow agriculture, according to a shared vision with the people. And that vision is very clear. We must be export oriented, for example. We must take advantage of our location. We must take advantage of our natural resources. The other thing that one must be look out for is that, are we having the right type of rewards to the people, or attracting the right type of people and giving them a right type of rewards when we attract people to those institutions that are absolutely crucial. And I'm for one saying we need to definitely reduce the number of ministries. And in fact, if I were to ask the question, my vote would really be going to someone who would say, I will not hesitate to attract whether it is Sri Lankan talent or foreign talent in order to, and pay them what they deserve, and also be meritocratic in the way in which talent is brought into ministries. I mean, we have situations where minister changes from one to another and the secretary changes. So that institutional memory, the knowledge that has been gained by that secretary, that institution is lost. And then suddenly the minister says, okay, we need another master plan. I have lost count of the number of tourism master plans, number of agricultural plans, number of whatever the plans. Ultimately, what we need is to agree on a common shared vision that we must be open to entering into free trade agreements. We must integrate with the South Asian, particularly with India, according to the vision document that was signed in 2023. And we must continue to strengthen institutions and attract the right type of talent. I wouldn't say even if it's not 100% meritocracy, at least in a reasonably meritocratic way.
Very quickly, Thilan, before I let you go for the day, what lessons can we learn from countries like India? Because India went through an economic depression in 1991. It took them nearly 3 decades to come out of it. And if you look at the last 5 years, last 8 years, India has shown tremendous progress in terms of their country's economy. From being the number 8 economy in the world, now they're almost touching the number 4th position in terms of the world economies as a whole. What lessons can we learn from countries like India and even the leadership for that matter? This year, there's an election in India, and it's quite evident that Prime Minister Narendra Modi may emerge victorious yet again this time around as well. How important is leadership? How important is building confidence, not only amongst the investors, but also the people of that country or that nation?
Absolutely. Leadership is everything. And I, for one, have always been advocating that any government that comes into power should look at attracting the right type of, that's why there's a national list. We've been a country where for 90% of the last 30 years, we haven't had a full-time finance minister. I mean, look at the qualifications of the Indian finance minister who came soon after the crisis in 1993 and what he did to basically reform what was called a license Raj. Look at the qualifications of the current finance minister and some of the other cabinet ministers. So I for one, I'm not talking of just academic qualification. I'm talking of people who have actually performed and demonstrated ability. So yes, leadership is everything, and as I was mentioning earlier, it must happen both at the political level and at the bureaucratic level. And I, for one, I believe that Sri Lanka is a far more easier country to govern. It can turn on a dime, and a handful of people, 10 ministers, 10 officials working in cohesion can change the fortunes of this country overnight.
Wishful thinking, Tilhan?
No, people are out there. I'm not marketing myself. I want to assure you, I'm very, very happy being in the private sector, running my small little businesses.
Right, thanks. Tilhan Vijayasinghe, a former chairman of BOI Sri Lanka, as well as an investment banker. Daniel Alphonsus, former advisor to the Minister of Finance. What are your closing remarks?
There are two things Sri Lanka needs to do. One is embrace a political system and a system of governance that has effective checks and balances, that prevents one person from being able to make disastrous decisions. And two, it needs to embrace the open market, free market reforms that it began on in 1978 and continued up to 2004. It has worked in the past, it has begun to work again, and it will work. If you look at our history, between 1948 and 1978, our Southeast Asian neighbors accelerated ahead while we were stagnant because they embraced the market. After 1978, our growth rates are not dissimilar. So what really cost us was those 30 lost years where we didn't embrace the world and we didn't embrace markets. Again, we've seen that happen in the late 2000s. We closed ourselves, we let the state become overmighty, and as a result, engage in wasteful and corrupt decisions. And we've seen where it's taken us today. So going forward, if we are to correct the mistakes of the last 70 plus years, what we need to do is abolish the executive presidency, establish a system of government that has effective checks and balances, and in parallel, open ourselves up to the world and embrace the market.
Daniel, I asked Tilhan what lessons can we learn from countries like India, but let's talk about countries like Vietnam, for an example. Even recently, President Ranil Wickremesinghe said that in 1992, the Vietnamese Minister of Finance had asked him what's Sri Lanka's secret recipe to attract FDIs to the country. And today, he's in a position to ask Vietnam the same question as to what their secret recipe has been to attract FDIs. What lessons can we learn from the nations around us? And why must we be very aggressive in our approach to attract FDIs for the betterment of the country? Because I recollect in your opening remarks, you said Matale Airport, the Lotus Tower, these projects did not bring in the required ROI to the country. How important is return on investment on projects?
I think you're absolutely right to talk about return on investment, because the way we think about export promotion is about marketing campaigns and so on and so forth. especially when it comes to manufacturing FDI, which is the most important bit of FDI, because that's what really improves your productivity and generates a lot of employment. What does an investor look for? They're sitting in a capital center, in the US, in Japan, in China now, and asking the question, where can I produce this product the most cheaply? That's the question that's being asked. And therefore, what we need to do is create an environment where we can produce the most cheaply a given product of any place in the world. So that means we need to look very carefully at the costs of production. What is the land cost? The state controls the vast majority of land in this country, and accessing that land is extremely difficult, therefore time-consuming, costly, etc. If we look at electricity, as Thilan mentioned, our electricity prices are high, makes us not competitive. If we take the labor market, Sri Lanka has an extremely unfavorable set of labor regulations. It's impossible almost to make somebody redundant, which especially in a time where you have to adjust your labor supply, makes the cost of labor very expensive. And because of our underinvestment in certain types of education, in particular mathematics and English education, adjusted for productivity, our labor isn't often that cheap. Then we have the whole governance side of things that Thilan referred to. Getting anything done through the state system is extremely difficult because you have institutional fragmentation, you have red tape, you have a lack of digitization. So all this makes Sri Lanka quite an expensive place to do business. And what we need to do is really focus on reducing these costs, enabling foreign investment to come in, generating those exports, which will generate the jobs and productivity improvements our country so desperately needs.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Daniel Alphonsus, former advisor to the Ministry of Finance. Murtaza Jafarji, chairman of Advocate Institute. Murtaza, I'm just going to pose a question to you so you can piggyback on that and give your answer. Daniel and Thilan spoke about getting anything done in Sri Lanka is very difficult. Is it so even now?
Yes, it is. And I can tell you as an investor and a businessman, most things, the permitting, you need 16 approvals, for example. And for example, if you Thilan alluded to the fact about land, and God help you if you need approval from the wildlife and the forestry and so many of the government agencies, basically, because there's no clarity on many of these things. So getting things done in Sri Lanka in an honest, in a non-corrupt way is extremely difficult, and you have to fix the system. But if I can summarize my thoughts, basically, I think Aragalia had it right. They said we need system change. Unfortunately, nobody defined what that system change is. And I would think that we should start, and I have said this before on your program, with the Democratic Socialist Republic of Sri Lanka. You see, a democracy is a rule by the people. A republic is ruled by laws. If you don't have both, if you only have a democracy, it will be a tyranny of demagogues. If you only have a republic, it will be a tyranny of oligarchs. We have to get the two together. So as Montesquieu said long ago, basically you have to have the separation of powers, that you have to have an executive arm, you have to have basically a legislative arm, and you will have to have a judicial system that keeps the checks and balances. And most importantly, which pertains to people like yourself, is you need an active media, basically. Now the problem in our system is that the executive arm is all powerful. The executive presidency, which is the apex of the executive arm, has to go. Then you have cabinet, which is part of the executive arm. I think we have to change the constitution, Shamir, to allow non-elected people who are professionals to be brought into cabinet, like in Indonesia, basically. Because running a ministry oversight is not necessarily the role of a parliamentarian. We have to restore the rule of parliament, which is to legislate. You see, we have a parliament that has one of the highest number of parliamentarians in the executive arm. Everybody wants to be a cabinet minister. I don't know why we need more than 15 cabinet ministers in a small country like Sri Lanka, basically. So we have to reorient. As I said, the administrative arm is a civil service. We have to strengthen it. But there is another very, very important thing, that this country is run for the benefit of 1,000 people. Economic benefits are flowing mainly to 100 people, basically. basically. So this, he talked about, protests, etc. It is the few who are inciting these protests. The people who have something to lose basically, who are massively benefited from this patronage based system, who are opposing all these changes. It is not the average citizen. If the average citizen has a market system, there is more competition, they're going to have cheaper prices, more choice, better quality. Why would they oppose? They will be for this, but they are not communicated properly. And that brings my role. Advocata started with the word advocate. We have to advocate for these good policies. And what am I doing? On the 18th of this month, the governor's diagnostic report basically that was issued, which is comprehensive, 130 pages. I don't think more than 100 people in Sri Lanka read it. It's an incredibly good, detailed document that says what we have to do. Advocata is going to host a one-day workshop basically and socialize it through social media and video and have a discussion of how we should action the recommendations in the report. Towards the end of June, we want to do a 2-day session basically where discuss how we are going to grow, because we have to grow through productivity and how you enable productivity through the economy. So my final words is to your audience and to the citizens that you can't leave it to the politicians to fix Sri Lanka. I think we all have a civic duty to educate ourselves. Civic society will have to play a large role in getting the type of changes, and that requires us to do homework. I mean, how many people in our country have read the Constitution basically? Very few. If you read the Constitution, you will understand what the powers of the president are and so many other things. How many people have read the governor's diagnostic report? At least read the executive summary. So there has to be a lot of citizen activity and translating these things to Sinhala and Tamil and get our population to really understand. And yourself calling people like myself on your show, the reason I'm coming here is to try to explain some of these things so that our people think more rationally and not make emotional decisions.
Good advice, Murtaza, for the coming elections. Murtaza Jafarji, chairman of Advocata Institute. Thilan Vijay Singh, former chairman of BOI, as well as an investment banker. Daniel Alphonsus, former advisor to the Ministry of Finance. Thank you very much, Theruni. Thank you very much, Shihar. Shihar is the Executive Director for Centre for Investigative Reporting. Today is May Day. I leave you tonight with a quote that was made by Steve Jobs. Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify them or vilify them. But the only thing that you can't do is to ignore them, because they change things. They push the human race forward. And while some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius, because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who really do. Take care and good night.